Welcome to the PFC podcast, where I, your host, Coach Mike Payton, break down various fitness and health facts to help you better make progress in the gym. Today, we're going to cover intensity. Let's first talk a little bit about what intensity is. In school, I learned intensity has to do with how much weight you're lifting. But I don't know about you. I've lifted some light weights and made it pretty intense. By changing things like tempo and things like that. So in my opinion, it doesn't directly correlate to how much weight you have on the bar. So your intensity level isn't more just because you have 300 pounds on the bar and you're doing a deadlift. But can that affect how much intensity you have to have in a workout? Oh, absolutely. Absolutely it does. Because if you have 300 pounds on the bar, and that's more than you've ever done, then you have to have a high level of intensity to be able to lift that weight. So, and why is intensity important, you might ask? Intensity is pretty directly correlated to how much progress you make, or if you make progress at all. So if you have a really low intensity, you go into the gym, you just lift some light weights, maybe you're doing a 10-pound bicep curl, and that's pretty easy for you, then you're probably not going to make as much progress as if you were actually challenging yourself. So your baseline, take your baseline, for example. So your baseline level of strength, is 10 pounds. Right, you can pretty easily and reliably lift 10 pounds bicep curl. How do you get better? Well, you have to challenge that. You have to go to that upper limit of how much you can lift. So say you're pretty reliable at lifting 10 pounds, and it's pretty challenging for you to lift 15 pounds. So that's 5 more pounds on each arm, and it's pretty difficult. It's okay, then you might be growing. You might make progress, because in order for your body to adapt, it has to know that there's something challenging for it to do. So if you have something that's challenging, your body's going to overcome and adapt to it. Of course, that gets into, you don't want to overdo it, and overdoing it gets you into a state of overtraining, or you might be really, really, really sore, and so then you can't train again. So there's this delicate balance between too much intensity and not enough intensity, because you have to have enough intensity to be able to challenge yourself to grow, and a low enough intensity to make it so that you're not absolutely dead after every workout. Because if you're absolutely dead after every workout, then you're probably not going to come back into the gym the next day or the day after that, because you're probably going to be really sore. So how do you balance that? There's a couple of different ways to do that. And we'll talk about those, and then we'll talk about some other things too that might be helpful for you to be able to decide how much weight to lift. So the first tool is the RPE scale. That's R, the letter P, E, the letter E. It's an acronym. It stands for Rated Perceived Exertion. So you're basically rating how much effort it takes to do a certain task on a scale of 1 to 10, basically. And the way you kind of look at it with weightlifting is how many more reps you could have done. So if you are at a 8 out of 10 on the RPE scale, then you probably could have done 2 more reps, roughly. So say you're doing bench press, you lift the weight up for 10 reps, man, I think I could have done 12. Then you're probably at a 2. You're probably at an 8, out of 10 on the RPE scale. If you go for a 1 rep max, that's a 10 out of 10 on the RPE scale, because you're pushing through it. You have nothing left. So that's the RPE scale. It's very useful. You also have RIR, which is rated or reps in reserve. So reps in reserve, basically the same as like this, how many more reps could you have done? So say I'm doing that bicep curl, right? I lift the weight up for 10 reps. I could have done 12. I had 2 reps in the tank, or 2 reps in reserve. It's pretty self-explanatory. So whenever you're lifting, how do you decide where you should be at on these scales? So RIR is, you probably want to be around a 3. And that's not like an easy 3 either. That's like, I could do 3 more. And the last one, I would be like struggling to get that weight up. Like struggling to pull that weight. Like you're really trying. So that's just to make that clear. Like, it's not, oh yeah, I could have easily done 3 more, like piece of cake. No, it's like, yeah, I probably could have done 3, but 2 definitely. That's like where you want to be. You could also be at a 2, that's fine as well. 1 is probably going to make you sore. 0 reps in reserve is a max. So like you could not have done any more. And that would be most likely too much. Unless you're going for a max. Then it's applicable, obviously. So RPE, similar thing. If you want to be growing and making progress, 3 or a 7 would probably be the minimum that I would go. If you go 8, 9, 10, you're going to be, the higher you go on that scale, the more you're going to be pushing yourself, and so the higher likelihood of muscle soreness, muscle fatigue you're going to have. So those are there's 2 major scales, and that's roughly where you want to be on those scales whenever you lift. So every time you do an exercise, what I would do is I would document that. So and that could be a whole nother podcast episode, is talking about volume and tracking that and everything. But primarily you want to be tracking something. You want to be tracking the weights you lift. That way you can progressively get stronger, progressively add weight. That way you can continually challenge yourself with this intensity. So every time you write down like, oh, I did bench press today, or if you have a program, you write down all these figures, how much weight you lifted, how many reps, sets you did, and I would document your intensity level. And you can use that RIR, 2 reps in reserve, 3 reps in reserve, 1 rep in reserve, that kind of scale. Or you can do your RPE scale. You can go, I was at an 8 RPE, 7 RPE, 9, 10 RPE for each of these exercises. So that's intensity. Those are the tools that I would use to help you to get that perfect balance of I'm not too sore and I'm not progressing. Let's talk about a few other things with intensity, because whenever I was coming up, started lifting, all these guys were talking about like, yeah, training to failure. And that has merit. That definitely has merit, especially for a more advanced lifter. If you're somebody who has been lifting for 10 years consistently, maybe even 5 years consistently, like you've been pretty consistent for a long time, then training to failure, I think, comes into play. And what can that look like? That can look like you go to that 10 RIR or that 10 RPE, and you go to that 0 RIR, and then you go a little bit past that even. You could go a little bit past failure. You could lift those weights up and then use the eccentric or the descent contraction of the muscle. So like bicep curl, you bring the weight up. That's your concentric. You let it drop down. That's the eccentric. You're actually stronger in the eccentric or the descent motion. And so you can you can use that. You can train a little bit past failure. But again, I would wait until you are more advanced in order to do that, because that's going to tip you over those scales most of the time, and probably either keep you at where you're at or regress you. It's going to make you worse. You could potentially get weaker, because if you're in a state of overtraining, you're going to get worse, or you're going to stay the same. Those are really the only two things that can happen. Because if you push too far, your body it's going to spend all its resources like repairing the damage, and not repairing a little bit and then adapting and growing. So you have to maintain that balance. So I would say try to hit that 3 to 2 RIR, or your 7 to 8 RPE, in order to make the most optimal gains and not make yourself absolutely sore and not able to go to work the next day, or be able to tolerate anything at work because you're ridiculously sore. Excuse me, does that mean that like you should never be sore? No. There are times that you should be sore. And if you're not sore most of the time, I might be a little bit concerned. If you're starting a new thing, you're doing something new, yeah, you're probably going to be sore because you haven't been challenged in that way. And so soreness should be expected, but not so much soreness that you aren't able to do your normal daily activities like wash the dishes, or walk around the house, or lift things at the store whenever you're at work, or pick up things at work, or sit down or stand up. Like, those are all things that you should be able to do even if you've worked out. And as a final little thought here, I want to talk about percentage of 1 rep max. So I'm not going to talk about like how to calculate your 1 rep max, but if you know your 1 rep max, that's also a super helpful thing whenever you're lifting. So I've used this with clients before, where we'll do a certain phase and then we'll do a max week where we'll test their 1 rep maxes on their bench, squat, deadlift, or whatever other compound exercises I want them to test their maxes on. And then throughout the next phase of training with those big lifts, those squat, deadlift, bench, or the other compound exercises that I'm having them do, or multi-joint exercises that I'm having them do, I will go down to about 70% of their 1 rep max. So that calculation is pretty easy. You take your 1 rep max, say it's 155 for a bench, you multiply it by 0.7, and there you go. You got 70% of your 1 rep max. And then you train with that at a sub-maximal like intensity, or you can train with it with a decently high like intensity. I'd say like maybe an 8 RIR or 2 reps in reserve, and that will also be super beneficial. So there's not all these exercises aren't going to be able to be done 1 rep max. I wouldn't do a 1 rep max bicep curl. That just doesn't make much sense to me. So you can test your maxes and then train with that lower intensity by percentage of your 1 rep max. So that's kind of where I was talking at the beginning, like your weight doesn't directly tie to intensity, but it can. And this is like an area where it can. So I hope these tools help you. I hope that they help you to make progress in the gym. And if you ever have any questions, just leave a comment, and I will be happy to respond. Or if you're able to find my Instagram, which is Coach Mike Payton, feel free to send me a message on there, and I will be so happy to help you out.